We will start with the panel discussion now. I'm Ranjini Mukherjee. I work as the Director Research, Knowledge Management and Capacity Development at CDRI. It's an immense pleasure for us to welcome you all to this panel discussion. We were also expecting Honorable Minister from Jamaica, Matthew Samuda, to join us, but due to another competing priority, he won't be able to join us today. But we would be recording this panel discussion and this will be made available to all the participants. We have an esteemed set of participants with us. We have Her Excellency Rudreta C. Thomas, the Ambassador of Climate Change, Antigua Barbuda with us. We are very delighted to have Dr. Biva Dhawan from TERI, Mafua Maka, the Director, National Disaster Risk Management Authority from Tonga, Judy Zakresi, Senior Vice President, International Code Council, and Dr. Ede Ejaz, who has been the lead coordinating author for the CDRI's Global Infrastructure Resilience Report and also the Senior Advisor on Climate Change and Infrastructure. I think we are still awaiting for Ryan Zuniga. We are not very sure. He must be on his way, but we will just start with the panel discussion. With this, I will request our Director General Amit Prothi to please make the special remark and set the context. Thank you.
We don't talk to each other as much as we should, and this has been a fantastic excuse for us today.
Thank you so much, Ranjini, and thank you all for joining us. I know we are starting to come towards the end of the conference, but the agenda remains incredibly important. So, we do want to talk about it, and purposely because we are also recording it and it will be available on CDRI's portal. So, why are we talking about strengthening infrastructure systems for resilience SIDS? While the minister has not been able to come right now, he and I had a chat about an hour ago where he stopped by to talk about Melissa that has just damaged quite a few. If you hear the numbers, we're talking about $7-8+ billion of losses in Jamaica. A lot of it is related to infrastructure and buildings. Our analysis, CDRI has been working on SIDS through a couple of different initiatives. We have a flagship report that starts to understand what is the amount of damage. So when you add up damage across all SIDS, we find that about $5 billion of losses can be experienced in island nations every year. And that's not a small amount for island nations. In some cases, one disaster wipes out a country's GDP completely. In other instances, like in Dominica, the country lost 2 or 3 times their GDP because of one single disaster. So, when you have economies that are small, geographies that are relatively small, and high vulnerabilities, the dependency on infrastructure is quite large, and when you lose that critical road, when you lose that critical port, when you lose that critical airport, your communication gets affected. It has a massive impact on the communities and people living in the island nations. So for CDRI, we're trying to see how do we support this agenda. We have a flagship initiative that was launched by the Prime Minister of India, Australia, UK, Jamaica, Mauritius, and Fiji about 4 years back at COP26. And now through that initiative, we've been able to support 25 island nations with technical assistance related to hospital infrastructure resilience, communication infrastructure resilience, transport infrastructure resilience, etc., etc. For us, the agenda will remain incredibly important, both from the evidence side of infrastructure resilience, why is the agenda important, and then on what do you do about building resilience. Both remain important. We already have quite a few SIDS that are members of the coalition. Currently, Jamaica represents the SIDS constituency on our executive committee, so they actually participate in all of the decision making. Previously, it was Dominican Republic. Fiji is quite engaged. So the SIDS are also engaged in the coalition's decision making system on what should the coalition do. Earlier this year, we had a conference in Nice, and we focused a lot on how do we bring this agenda of island nations together, and we identified 3 opportunity areas for CDRI. One is around data. How do we get the right kind of data in the hands of decision makers in islands so that the risks, current risks and future risks are better understood. The second is the codes and standards. How do we ensure that the infrastructure and buildings that are being built or upgraded in island nations meet the challenges of tomorrow? And the third was around enforcing or supporting capacities that are much needed in island nations. So these three agendas remain very strong for the coalition. We'll talk a little bit more in the panel discussion, but I just wanted to highlight that for CDRI, vulnerability in island nations is incredibly important. Addressing that through data, through capacity building, through technical assistance, codes and standards, etc., is where we are prioritizing our work. With that, I'd like to hand it over back to Ranjini. Thank you, Ranjini.
Thank you, Amit, for giving such a wonderful overview of our IRIS initiative. Now, to further elaborate on that a little more, may I request my colleague Kopal or Chandan to kindly play the video, a short video, which gives you a very good overview of the IRIS program.
Thank you so much. It's been recorded. I'll come back to you on that. Apart from the fact that there will be people that are there,
CDRI's dedicated initiative, co-curated with SIDS, IRIS, aspires to equip these small island nations with knowledge, tools and partnerships needed to achieve sustainable development through resilient and inclusive infrastructure. CDRI is committed, through IRIS, to support the Antigua and Barbuda agenda for SIDS. The coalition has been awarded the prestigious United Nations SIDS Partnerships Award 2024 for the IRIS program.
When infrastructure is damaged or disrupted, there is a significant toll on lives and livelihood. This is an urgent agenda, and the award today goes a long way to reinforce that partnerships such as those established through IRIS are not only necessary but critical for SIDS to meet the sustainable development agendas.
Central to this work is a $40 million technical assistance program that enhances capacities of SIDS government agencies, private enterprises, and communities to implement post-disaster recovery and DRI action at scale while contributing to three outcomes. CDRI's technical assistance through IRIS is supporting initiatives in 25 SIDS.
IRIS funding is vital in supporting the agenda for disaster-resilient infrastructure in small island developing states. Dominica, with its ambition of becoming the first climate-resilient nation in the world, is leveraging IRIS resources to enhance its housing resilience.
Working on strengthening the resilience of our infrastructure is a necessity. It is something we cannot postpone, and it is probably the best investment that we can do at this time. We see the CDRI as a major partner for the development of our infrastructure, for the development of the resilience of our infrastructure for the years to come.
The coalition will continue to support SIDS through technical assistance, collaboration, collective action, and partnerships that are essential to drive the agenda of resilient infrastructure, achieve economic progress, and a secure future for SIDS.
Thank you, Kopal, for holding the mic. I think it made a lot more clearer to all of us what the video says. Okay, with this, as Amit rightly already mentioned during his opening remarks, that SIDS faces disproportionate economic risk owing to severe and recurring extreme weather events and geophysical disasters, which leads to huge damage to the infrastructure and economic losses. As a part of our Global Infrastructure Resilience Report 2025, which we released this Monday, a working paper has been produced which provides deep analytics on the infrastructure risks in SIDS along with a call to action. I will request our lead coordinating author, Ede Ijaz, to make a brief presentation on the working paper and take you through the various statistics and data that are there in the working paper along with the call to actions. Over to you, Ede.
Thank you so much and good morning to everybody. What I want to spend the next 5-6 minutes is to telling you the deep dive that we did for small island development states using the global infrastructure resilient model and a deep dive on the working paper. Now, the global infrastructure risk model and resilience, GIRI, uses the same kind of approaches that the insurance industry use. So for those of you who work in the SIDS, it's similar to what the CRIF facility would use or the PCRAFI would use in the Pacific. So it's a first fully probabilistic and model, but it's not a black box like the industry that is proprietary, but it's for governments to use the information in planning exercises. If you look at the global numbers, they are really big. Annually, on average, the losses are calculated to be more than $700 billion a year from all hazards, from landslides and floods and earthquakes and cyclones, etc. And for all infrastructure sectors, roads, airports, power supply, water supply, as well as buildings. Now, so for example, we did a calculation, you can do downscaling to regions. And we did in Africa, it's about $12.7 billion a year. And we did a deep dive for small island development states. And what we find is that when we look at the SIDS, the average annual loss of infrastructure sectors is about $5 billion. And this is the division because you can look by sector, what happens in the power, what happens in water supply. And the biggest ones that you lose are on the telecommunications and on the power. This is for the infrastructure sector. Now, you can also see by hazard type, and what you see, cyclones and hurricanes, of course, are the largest. But the surprise is that then the next one is flood. And what is interesting is that many people tend to forget the earthquakes. And earthquakes are about 12% of the total losses on average. And you will remember the two big earthquakes in Haiti that happened in that process. So what this allows you is to have this probabilistic model to understand that process by hazard, by sector, by country. Now, what is also something that we know is that infrastructure is important, but the most of the damage are on the buildings, public and private, all of the houses. If you see Melissa, the majority of the damages are on the buildings. So in our probabilistic model, 70% of the losses are related to buildings, 30% to infrastructure. And therefore, being able to make housing more resilient, being able to reconstruct in a way that actually uses more of the traditional ways of building so that wind speeds are resisted better, so that the anchors with the new technologies are used, handles that process. Another important finding is that $5 billion compared to the $700 billion of the world is a very small amount. But when you compare to the infrastructure that they have in the small island development states, it's proportionally very big. So the message is, if the world really wanted to fix resilience for the SIDS, it's not a big amount. But if you are going to leave the SIDS alone to fix it, it's just a huge amount. So you see here where we calculate the relative losses, loss divided by the total infrastructure stock versus the actual losses. So on this curve, you see the OECD countries, big losses, but proportionally small, while for the SIDS, It's relatively small losses for the world, but tremendously important for the SIDS in that process. So the message to the world is that if you wanted to solve the resilience problem of the SIDS, it's not a big amount. It is doable. We also group by countries and subdivisions, and you see the annual average losses, absolute and relative. Caribbean has a lot more because it has a lot more assets and higher incomes than the Pacific. And these are the associated states, the Puerto Rico and some of the Nouvelle Calédonie and all of that, where they have a lot of infrastructure. So this model allows you to look by region, by sector, by country, and it is all publicly available for governments to use and understand the issue altogether. This is the QR code for the report and the database that you can use in that process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ede, for that very succinct and yet very interesting presentation on this SIDS. With this, now we will start with our panel discussion, and I'll request my colleague Chandan to take over the floor. He would be moderating the session. So thank you.
Thank you, Ranjini and dignitaries. It's a pleasure to have you here. I would like to welcome the panelists on the dais. Ambassador Roleta Thomas, please welcome on the dais. She's the ambassador for Antigua and Barbuda, and she is taking lead in the climate diplomacy for the nation and a very strong voice for SIDS. I welcome Ms. Judy Zachrezi, the Senior Vice President for International Code Council. She has been very instrumental in developing standards codes for small island developing states, which is the foundation of resilient infrastructure. I now welcome Director General Ms. Dhawan on the dais. She has been leading a very important development agency for called TERI, the Energy and Resource Institution. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your presence here. I am Chandan, and Mr. Ryan is also joined us. I welcome Ryan Zuniga. He's the Senior Project Development Specialist with the 5 Cs, the Caribbean Community for Climate Change Center. Welcome, Ryan. I would like to start the discussion with Ambassador later. Ambassador, Antigua Barbuda has played a very crucial role in the development of Antigua and Barbuda agenda for SIDS. And I would like to know from you that how is the international cooperation and the global diplomacy is playing a role in building resilience of SID and actually accelerating it. If you can throw some light on it for us.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I think there are 3 areas that international cooperation and diplomacy are playing a role. One is advocacy and communication, because I think we assume that people understand our vulnerability, and very often they don't. And so that is one area I think that us as small island developing states continually speaking about our own experiences, which are quite different from others. And in that advocacy, it's important to also understand that every island is different. Our geography, even from our coastline geography, our physical location, our on-land geography, the sheer impact of our size, our location, our climate, resilience is different because of that. And the differences also come from the history of past impacts and how your population has had to deal with that in the past. So all of these issues need to be communicated, and it needs to be clearly understood that exactly where our vulnerabilities lie. The second tier of that is technological support. Technological support in hard technology and in the planning, the research, and the design part of it. SIDS face very special circumstances. Technology that can apply in Europe is not necessarily um, useful for Caribbean islands that are exposed to salt. Um, and so you have to take into consideration when developing technology your physical impacts on the technology itself. You also have to, so even in Antigua and Barbuda, I'll give you an example that is not necessarily resilience, but we have sargassum. So there are people who have lost their electric vehicles because when the sargassum inundates the shoreline, the sulfur dioxide that is produced goes into the electronics and corrodes it. And so people lose household electronics, and anything with an electronic component to it can be lost. I live from where the sargassum is to where I live is about 3 miles, and I've had corrosion. So, there are unique perspectives that need to be considered in terms of the development of the technology, the design of the technological solutions and the application, and not to just looking back on one of the graphs you showed in terms of the impacts. You have earthquakes, hurricanes. So somebody was asking me the other day, oh, why don't you just plant trees around the homes to cool it? I said, but we have hurricanes. So the hurricane will destroy, right? So why don't you just build a concrete roof? We have earthquakes. So we have to, in developing technology, you have to actually integrate all the risks that we have. And I'm very happy that you showed all the risks. There's one element of risk that was not shown here, that is the coastal risk of just these storms that are coming down from the US that cause a lot of coastal damage that are not captured under any of the categories that listed, and because they're not captured, there's no data, and that's the other thing. In the communication, we have to communicate other than what is registered as a risk. There's some other risks that we face that are not registered with the data. And I think the final point in terms of how these conferences and our engagements help is mobilization of finance and communicating the scale of finance that is necessary. I think Minister Samuda has been speaking about the scale that is necessary. What is being paid out to Jamaica now is less than 1 billion with a B US dollars. And I think the latest figure of the current damage is 10 billion with a B. And so when we even look at the loss and damage fund and look at the fact that that is only capitalized now with pledges to 800 million with an M, and that the first round of proposals, one project can only be, the maximum amount for one project will be 20 million with an M, you can see the scale of the gap that is there now, even for one event that was just a few hours. And so in terms of these forums, I think one, the scale of the financing and the fact that even though it looks like a lot of money, the impact and the requirement to build resilience as a response to these impacts is much, much greater. And the other thing with respect to the finance piece is, again, understanding the need for the finance. I was making the example of when we're talking about financing resilience, what are we talking about? So we all wear shoes. So imagine you're walking down the street, you have $2 in your pocket, and your shoe disintegrates. And then there's a booth with a shoe for $2, and there's a booth with a shoe for $10. You know that the $2 shoe is only going to last you 3 months, but you only have $2 and you need it now. You know that the $10 shoe is going to last you 10 years, but you only have $2. And so what we need as SIDS is to leverage that gap. And what we are doing here is engaging and trying to find solutions about how we fill that gap to implement these reports, implement the recommendations in these reports when we need to implement them. Because unfortunately, after a disaster, is the best time to go and do the resilience because it's gone anyway and you're going to have to build it back. So you have the $2 in your pocket. When you have to come and plan and move people, and so that's a little bit more difficult politically. And honestly, it doesn't, the momentum around the effort isn't gathered. It's not as urgent because there's health, there's education, there's all of these other priorities. But after a disaster, we need to be able to find a mechanism that leverages the resilience investment at this time quickly. Otherwise, we'll buy the $2 shoe. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that powerful. I think you made a very valid point on the urgency to address the challenge and the financing gap and involvement of SIDS into finding solutions. It's not that somebody who doesn't know the context provides a solution, but SIDS voice needs to be integrated in the solution that is proposed for SIDS. And I would like to just highlight that SIDS like Antigua, Barbuda, Jamaica, and Fiji have been playing a very crucial role in developing and enriching CDRI's intervention, especially on IRIS, where they are part of the steering committee, where they present their voice and their aspirations. Thank you so much for highlighting that. I'd like to go to Ms. Judy Zachrezi next. My question to you would be on the implementation of codes and the standards for accelerating resilient infrastructure in SIDS. What do you think are the key enablers that would help on adoption of these standards and codes, particularly when we see in the context of a regional settings where many SIDS face similar risks and challenges? How do you want to accelerate these adoption of these standards and codes?
Thank you for that question. And I need to apologize to everyone in advance because I have another session that I need to lead just at the Buildings Hub at 1 o'clock. So I'm going to be leaving in a few minutes. I'm going to stay as long as I can and then head over, but I appreciate the question. I would say that the most important thing is having the political will at the national level. It needs to start with a government wanting to make efforts and to prioritize. You know, there's all kinds of competing priorities when there's a disaster, when there's a bucket of funding, and so we need the infrastructure resilience to win the battle of competing priorities. Another thing that I would say is very important is a consideration of the full regulatory ecosystem, sort of looking beyond adopting a code, not just taking the first code that's available, making sure that it's right-sized and appropriate, especially in a SIDS context. You know, there are multi-hazard factors and unique factors that are at play. And I appreciated the reference to the sort of non-climate hazards like earthquakes, which are critical, and making sure that the building code addresses multi-hazard events and looks at prioritizing which hazard is most important, like the concrete roof, right? If you're having an earthquake, you don't want the roof to be concrete. And so while that roof might protect you against a hurricane, what's the optimal design? And so the code, I think, is really important to kind of help to contextualize the standards and help to understand what kind of design is called for in any particular case. I think there's a lot of value in a regional approach that you mentioned when there are a lot of SIDS facing similar hazard conditions, and I think that's one way of expediting and also maybe reducing the overall cost burden. You know, I'll give you an example, and it's a bit of an interesting example because we worked with the Caribbean, the CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality, CROSS-Q. That has members of all the national standards bodies in the Caribbean nations as members, and we worked with them to develop an energy code, a regional energy code. Now, it's interesting because we would generally advise that the first code to have in place is a building code, a general building code, not an energy code. But I think, you know, because of the environment that we're in, and it's sort of It's sexy to invest in energy efficiency, and it's also, you can measure the progress. You know, if you're the amount of carbon output or the amount of energy usage, it's not so easy to measure resilience, right? You're kind of proving a negative. So I think there's a lot more investment funds available for energy efficiency and for mitigation. And I would like to see more funds available for adaptation and resilience. That's my little side note. But we worked with CARICOM or CrossQ to develop this regional energy code. And so that they convened the national standards bodies of all 15 CARICOM nations to use a model code that was developed by ICC and optimize it for use in the Caribbean. All of the countries bought in, they were all invested in it, they all signed off on it, and now there's a model energy code for the Caribbean that it's appropriate. The standards bodies signed off on it, and so all of the countries in CARICOM and beyond, and perhaps even in the Pacific. You know, I haven't seen any Pacific Island nations adopt that, but we have this customized code now for the Caribbean, and CrossQ actually now is in the process of updating that code. And we're also separately talking to them about developing a building code that will help more with the resilience issues. But I think that having this sort of regional approach can really not only reduce the initial cost burden, but the harmonization across a region also has resilience benefits. When you think about if there's a disaster in one country and you have engineers that are trained on that same code in a different country that maybe perhaps wasn't affected, they can help, right? They have resources. There are certain aspects of enforcement and compliance with the building code that don't have to be done on site, like plan review, right? So you could have a pool of plan reviewers that understands the regional code, and then each country doesn't have to have their own plan reviewers. It can be centralized, it can be online. There's so much that technology can do. And I'm not saying AI plan review. I'm saying a person who's been trained to do plan review. But if they're reviewing a plan for Jamaica, they don't necessarily have to be based in Jamaica if there's a common code used. So I think there's a lot of benefit we can gain from integration and collaboration, and that extends beyond the code into thinking through the whole ecosystem for compliance. You know, I mentioned plan review, but there's also economies to be gained by having similar training, similar credentialing exams, maybe even setting up similar regulatory systems, which need to be localized and which need to be adapted to each country's governance. But the closer you can get to having customized resources, and even then beyond that, using a model code that's already been developed with resources that haven't been developed, it's sort of a force multiplier. It kind of, you're starting at a higher level than from the ground.
Thank you, Ms. Zakrazi. I think very important point on regional harmonization, how similar codes and buildings can accelerate the cooperation, regional cooperation between countries and bring them together to solve the problems. Thank you very much. I'll now move to Mr. Ran Zuniga. He's the Senior Projects or Development Specialist from 5Cs. You have worked very extensively in the Caribbean region. According to you, what mechanisms do you see as most effective in accelerating the resilience agenda in SIDS? And how do you see that, again, a coordinated approach in the Caribbean has resulted benefits and impacts on the ground?
Thank you very much for your question, and I apologize for being late. I had another speaking event. But I think the two speakers before me did a very good job in terms of laying the groundwork. Ambassador highlighted our unique circumstances in the Caribbean. And so while there is efforts to build resilience, I think we have to understand that it's not a one-size-fits-all for all our member states. While we have similar vulnerabilities, there are unique circumstances of each of and every CARICOM member states that we take into consideration when we design these interventions. But if we're looking at general responsiveness or general efforts to increase resilience, um, uh, two things keep coming up when it is that we look at critical infrastructure in the region, and that's around utilities. As you know, during these events, one of the first things that would go is access to electricity and how it is that we provide support to CARICOM member states to ensure that their energy generation system or energy systems can withstand the impact of some of these hazards that we deal with in the Caribbean. And for example, there are two countries in which we have mobilized support from CDRI to support Belize and St. Kitts. Belize looks at and both takes this post-disaster need assessment or post-disaster need response into consideration in how it is that they design and implement their project. While St. Kitts are looking at utilities and how it is that we could build robust utility systems, how it is that our utilities can withstand these impacts. Belize take the effort of or the approach of looking at how it is that we could augment homes and to ensure that people are in a place where they are able to withstand the impacts, but also be able to build back better. And key to that is understanding what is there. And we find in a lot of our member states that basic information in terms of building footprints, what is on the ground, the type of infrastructure, where our critical infrastructure are, what is needed to augment our critical infrastructure is missing. And to support to just build that rich data set so that when it is that we get to a point where we mobilize our response, where it is that we mobilize investments, we know the type of investments that we need to put forward, and they're very targeted and strategic to help build resilience across the CARICOM member states. And so looking at these two particular areas, and a lot of the funds would tell you, right, when it is that we try to mobilize funds for critical infrastructure, it's very difficult because of using the whole issue for grants for cement. Some of our donors would call it, why it is that we're going to invest public sector finance into individual homes and hurricane shelters and that sort of thing in certain areas. And we get a lot of pushback, believe it or not, when we try to mobilize these funds from the 5Cs, from different donors. But it's essential and crucial for our inherent vulnerabilities in the region to be understood. How it is that you address the other problem if you have to be concerned about where you're going to live. Your basic needs cannot be met after disaster. And then there's no support for that. And so Ambassador gave the perfect example in terms of the shoe. All right, can we afford to pay $2 for a shoe or $10 for a shoe, knowing that in the next storm or next event, that $2 shoe is not going to help us withstand whatever impact comes our way, right? And so looking at these critical infrastructure across the region is extremely important, not only from a data collection standpoint, but the investment to make more robust systems available to our people in the Caribbean.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I think, yeah, there is a very solid case to tap the resilience dividends. As per our global infrastructure report that we have launched on the 17th, it clearly states that any investment on resilience of infrastructure can give up to 7x or up to 10x of returns. I think those considerations when we are planning our infrastructure projects are to be considered, and the gap of $8 that Ambassador mentioned, I think that needs to, the resilience dividend can be used as a means of attracting that finance. Thank you very much for your response. I would now go to Dr. Ms. Dhawan. Dr. Dhawan, Terry has been working very closely with some specific islands, SIDS like the Fiji, Tuvalu. In your experience in that region, what are the key enablers that you see as the areas of interventions which can really enhance resilience of SIDS and in a quicker way, and which can be fixed with some level of intervention immediately in a short term, and what would be those enablers that you look at for the long term?
Yeah, thank you so much. And so much has been said, really speaking, sensitizing that where the money should go. Because with little money, you can achieve a lot. Needless to say, these are beautiful areas, and it is not that they are just beautiful. If you look at the ecosystem maintenance, you really require them. Now, let's come to the problems, and some of them have already been listed. What I'll also look at that are we doing enough in terms of modeling? The climate modeling in these regions is extremely important because that will guide us where the infrastructure should be put in. The second aspect is that we again have to look into, like when we talk of climate change, they are going to impact these small islands, but let's also look at that, are these small islands taking adequate steps themselves to I won't say stopping is difficult, but in a way delaying the their own actions. And in many of the islands, and we all are to be blamed because we love to go there for holidays, and therefore what we do there is we add to the waste, we add to its tourism, which they also want in terms of GDP. They require tourism to be an important industry, but somewhere it also adds or it has negative long-term impacts. You have motorboats, we waste so much of water, the drinkable water, so our demands are too high. So, and then it is also the waste generation. They also do a lot of fishing. Now, what do we do with the fish waste? Can that be used for generating energy? Or what else can be done over there? So, those are some of the researchable areas. Now, having said that, and our own experience in many of these islands is that, and very rightly also mentioned, that you really have to first is can we avoid them, then is preparedness, and third is how do you rebuild. And when you rebuild, and I really liked the way Ambassador explained in layman's language that we don't have money. If you, therefore, the choices you have to make are not the best suited for the region, those are based on the finances available. But then let's also recognize that in years to come, if you only invest $2, even that's going to go down the drain. So you really have to work towards that. How do we ensure, and it is not just ecosystem, it is not just the area where hurricane is, let's also value humans over there, because if you lose them or the way they lose whatever they have, it is not one generation, it's couple of generations perhaps they'll take that much of time to recover from what they have lost. So, what we really need to look into, and of course, there are going to be, I should say, new methods of generating money as well, because most of these areas there is potential to grow mangroves and therefore earn carbon credits, and otherwise, also the areas are so fertile. So, carbon markets we can look into so that it becomes a self financing kind of a program for them. Buildings, of course, lots have been said that in terms of buildings, you really have to look into certain standards. And I'll also say that another important area that we have to look into is greening of ports on all these. And it's both like shipping industry is important for them, and there are possibilities. Of course, IMO is a regulator, but at the same time, the regulations in countries, they are not that strict, and but then they should realize it is not something which is being enforced upon. They should see it as that something which will save them in future. So it is both, it is bringing awareness about all these issues. It's also, let's look into the carrying capacity of these regions even in terms of tourism, and then looking into a sort of ecotourism. And I really like example in Maldives, where every day you stay you have to pay green tax. So they should also collect taxes from those who visit them and take part of their infrastructure development. So therefore I'll say carbon credits as well as other mechanisms to support their own infrastructure as well as preparedness And it goes without saying, climate modeling as well as energy modeling will help in a big way. So, what we need to do is we have to look into, and there are a lot of programs. And in fact, I was in ISA a little while ago, and they mentioned about their energy initiatives that they have taken in the islands, the feasibility studies that have been undertaken, and pilots training. So all these are extremely important, and let's also look at other partners who are supporting such activities. So thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Dhawan. I think a very important point on climate modeling. We have CDRI has its own GIRI portal. It's a risk model that we have developed for all the countries in the globe. It shows the climate risks to various countries, the risk to infrastructure across the sectors. It provides an average annual loss figure for countries, based on which the countries can assess their risk to their infrastructure from hazards like floods, like earthquakes, etc. A very important tool for the governance or the policy makers to decide on the infrastructure investments. Thank you. I know Zakaria has to leave, so I'll ask her question now. You have about the standards and codes you just highlighted in your intervention about the need for governance, the need for enhanced, regulations and governance. Can you just elaborate how, in your experience, you have helped SIDS, improve their regulations, improve their governance mechanisms to implement the standards and codes for resilient infrastructure?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. And I'll just put in a plug for a session that I'll be leading here at 4:30, 4:15 today, about the work that we've done with the Republic of Marshall Islands, which has a customized building code. And we've just spent some time this year working with them on training and putting their codes online so that they have an AI navigator available to help, navigate the codes, and the online portal, so they can collaborate, within the ministry to use the codes. I think all of those tools are really important. We've seen them leveraged in other countries, and I think the message is that having a building code is a wonderful step to celebrate, but it's not the end point. Right, and in developing the code, you need to consider what capacity exists or needs to be built in order to get effective compliance. And so it's all the things that we know about, right? Training, credentialing, product evaluation, and all of this is really important because it ensures that your code actually results in resilient and safe buildings. And particularly the product evaluation, and it doesn't cost the government anything. It's just kind of thinking through what regulations need to be in place. And for credentialing of individuals, the government doesn't have to pay for that. They just need to regulate it and enforce it and say to the manufacturers of building materials, you need to have your products tested to these certain standards that we're going to enforce. And then the manufacturers who want their products used are the ones that have to comply, and so it just becomes a process. And so kind of putting that regulatory infrastructure in place, it doesn't cost the government anything, but it can help to greatly enhance the overall impact of having the codes. And referring to professional organizations, to credential engineers. And the government just wants to know that those engineers are credentialed so that they can inspect buildings. And again, the product evaluation can also prevent dumping, right? If there are a lot of countries in the world that have high product standards, the manufacturers that are producing lower quality products, they can't sell into those markets. So where are they going to sell? To the markets that don't have strong regulatory infrastructure. So it's all for the protection of the country, and the government just needs to kind of think through that and put the policies in place that will enable the compliance of the codes. And all of this is known. It's just kind of thinking through it and thinking very holistically about the ecosystem that's needed to achieve safer, more resilient buildings.
Thank you, Ms. Judy Zakrisky. I know you have to leave, so
Thank you.
thank you very much for your time and your valuable inputs. And your inputs have really enriched this conversation.
Thank you, and thank you to CDRI and to my fellow panelists. It was a pleasure. I'm sorry I can't stay.
I'll move to Ambassador Rudelater for the next question. Ambassador, in Ms. Judy Zakrisky's point, she made some valid point about how there are some interventions that can happen without any finances like governance and regulatory mechanisms. But the question on resilient recovery, the $8 question still remains. So, in your view, what would be an appropriate partnership or financing mechanism that we should all look at for the future for resilient recovery wherever there has been damage, like in the case of Jamaica, or otherwise also where there are adaptation measures getting implemented and planned for, and what should be those international financing mechanism that you would like to have?
Okay, thank you. And let me respond to the points that were made. Everything has a cost. We are small islands, and even to put in a regulation has a cost. Even for the enforcement of the regulation has a cost. Even to train our building inspectors up to a standard has a cost. So while it doesn't look like it has a cost, everything has a cost. The idea of building codes, I wanted to add one point to it as well. The building codes that we have to implement to be resilient to a catastrophe like what happened in Jamaica, we can't afford it. So with respect to how we finance, we already put the structures in place. We have the loss and damage fund, we have the SCCF, we have these funds. The problem is they are not being capitalized, and there's too much bureaucracy between the time you speak in these nice forums to the time you get the money. And so, as again, we have $2 in the pocket, even though you can get $10 million or you can get the $10, but it's 2 years away. I have to get a shoe today, otherwise I literally cannot walk. And so this is the issue. With respect to the creative financing, we have tried that in the Caribbean. We have tried offshore banking, we were blocked. We have tried to look at trade measures, we have been blocked. So where we are in the Caribbean is not for lack of our own knowledge in creatively financing. It is, we are at a point where this is what we can do. For example, let's look at the whole AI transformation, and can we invest in AI? Look at the energy cost of AI tools. So, we have tried taxing tourism. Everybody just doesn't come, and our economy goes to zero. We do not have the scale of fisheries to use the byproducts, right? We are now facing new problems such as sargassum, which is being blamed on climate, but it's really a pollution issue caused by who? Other people outside. So, the Caribbean is not in lack of ideas for solution. We've tried it. We are at a stage now where we have tipped coral reefs, for example, in terms of ecosystems. So we know ecosystems provide natural goods and services. We know mangroves protect us. But the climate is changing, and therefore the ecosystems are changing. We do not have the type of coastlines, most of us don't have the type of coastlines where mangroves will just grow. You would have to engineer it in. And if you're engineering it in, what's the cost and what is the reliability? So in Barbados, for example, I'll give a comparison from Hurricane Beryl last year, where there was a natural protection mechanism and there was an engineered. So in the Union Islands, there's mangroves, lots of mangroves, where traditionally fishermen would take their boat. So anybody with a boat would take it into the mangroves. And in Barbados, where their fishery landing point is, they have an engineered breakwater curved around to protect the fishing. When Beryl was approaching, all the boats went to Trinidad. You could see it on the map. they were running, because our fishermen know that the mangrove cannot protect you from a Category 5 storm. So the natural resilience systems that we are so focused on, which is, there's no problem with being focused on it, but we've tipped their ability to provide the protection. In Barbados, where they built the wall, they built the resilience in, and the fisheries complex got destroyed. So whether it's a green, blue, or gray solution, we have reached tipping points, and therefore what we're talking about here is not the regular intervention. You can get a loan, you can do that. What we're talking about is when the shoe has dropped off your foot and you have reached a tipping point and I need the money now. Where am I getting that from? And that was supposed to be the loss and damage fund, and it's not working. So you're asking me now what else to do. It's there already. It's not me you have to be asking that question. It is the donors that you need to ask that question to. We have done everything. You keep coming back to small islands. We have done everything that you have asked us for. Every single thing. And still we are having a problem.
And I think that's a really, really, really important point. And I think part of the reason we wanted to highlight that 5 billion number, because when you start actually imagining how much it will take, it's actually not that much when you talk about global financing, right? I mean, I'm sorry to be sort of, but that never comes into the conversation. It's always about big numbers, but actually what is needed for the islands is not actually that big. I mean, you've got billionaires sitting in this planet with more money, right? And to me, I think that's why we wanted to make sure that at least we are putting data out there that may help in these conversations, because the scale of the ask is actually not that great. I just wanted to respond to that.
Thank you. And the ease of accessing that fund and the bureaucracy that you highlighted, I think very, very valid and very important for the access of the funds that are available. My next question would be to Mr. Rand Raniga. When you are talking about a scale of operations in a region like the Caribbean, how could regional platforms that are using our shared risk data systems, pooled financing models, or even regional engineering solutions can help countries move from isolated project-oriented approach to more systems level approach? In your view, how is that shaping up?
That's a very good question. I think what we have to do is to ensure that we understand our vulnerabilities first. Understanding our vulnerabilities and vulnerability, as you would know, is an aspect of, do you see yourself vulnerable? And what are you vulnerable to? And so if you're going to design a system to address that, people must understand what it is that they want to get out of the system. Now, we often like to group the Caribbean as one. And we are close in terms of proximity. There are a lot of similarities, but there's also a lot of differences. And so while we can take a programmatic approach, which is what I see as a system, a programmatic approach, we must also take into consideration national circumstances and how implementing such a system is going to address unique circumstances on the ground across the region. But there are also benefits in terms of economies of scale that can be beneficial to implementing such a system. The challenge in terms of we've been having a lot of conversation around mobilization of funds. There's also a challenge of being able to absorb some of those funds within our member states, and how it is that we not only mobilize the funds, but we get the impact that we're looking for through implementation. Because project development is one thing, but if you're not able to then implement, and in the time that we need to do so, are you really building resilience at the end? And so we've been talking about the scale of financing, but we also have to build robust systems in the region which allow us to implement better. And it's not that we don't have the capacity. it goes back to some of the same conversation in terms of what are the gaps. But then we look at some of the procurement gaps and some of the technologies that are not Caribbean grown or not ensured, or we did not ensure that it's fit for purpose within our context. That presents some of the challenges that we're trying to bring a foreign technology or foreign system into the Caribbean, and we're not really ensuring that that is representative of what we need in the region. But from a general system design, system implementation standpoint, I think you have to build a system from the bottom up. You can't take a top-down approach to the system. We are unique. We have unique circumstances. Again, those can be generalized. But also when you get into countries, when you get into communities, you start to see where the nuances are. And you have to ensure that whatever system you have at the top speaks to those nuances on the ground, because resilience is not at a country level. Resilience is at an individual level. And you have to build individual resilience before you build national resilience. Because you build national systems, but people will still be vulnerable on the ground. And how do you ensure that that trickles down to the average person within our communities? And so any systematic approach to mobilize finance, project implementation, project design, must take into consideration national circumstances, community differences, and how that system is going to trickle down to the average person on the ground and build resilience at that level.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. I think, it's about being a bottom-up approach and resilience getting embedded and reaching the last person in the community. I think very, very important and enriching point here. My last question would be to Ms. Dr. Dhawan. Dr. Dhawan, when you're implementing these programs or resilience programs in SIDS, what do you think are the capacity needs to be scaled up in terms of interagency coordination or intergovernmental coordination also, to ensure that our infrastructure resilience across the life cycle of the infrastructure is maintained, and especially in this context of intensifying disaster risk?
See, the point which Amit is making repeatedly, like if we look at the total demand for funds, it's not that big. And that is where it should be the first thing. Now what happens, and that is true across nations, across all the programs, what we are doing is we are looking at climate change as a separate thing from energy transition. And that is separate from waste management and pollution. So what we need to actually do is integrate each one of them, because ultimately we are looking at the development and we are looking at how do we come up. And the moment we do that, perhaps our finances are going to be further reduced, our demand from the finances. Just to give you an example, like one program which we have done, that was looking into fish waste. It's almost, if you process fish, it's 50% of it goes as waste. It's head, tail, and other things. And most countries, because they can't afford it, there is no waste management system. It's simply put into the ocean again. And then, of course, there are other problems associated with that waste. On the other hand, if you use that waste for energy generation, it becomes an integrated system. You really don't have to either burn fossil fuel, which is again very common in all the small island states. They burn a lot of diesel generators, all those things. So you take care, so indirectly you are taking care of the environment as well. And energy demand is getting reduced. Air pollution is getting reduced. So what is happening in most cases, and that is international donors also, they look in isolation. They'll say, we'll try to solve one problem. We don't take integrated approach to solve all the problems. And it can very well be done, like you take models, you develop at least couple of islands in diverse areas and say, this is what is the total demand. And then I'll also say somewhere, when we say capacity building, that is also required in a big way. It is, when I say capacity building, I'll go right from the person, the policy maker. Of course, you are very good, so I'm not pointing fingers at you. But in many cases, even policy makers they don't appreciate why should they go green. And then is how do you use energy that can be made from various sources? So what is the investment, what is the payback? And then you look into, like, for, I repeatedly say, carrying capacity of islands. So there it is, how much of floating population can we really afford? I'm not living for today, how much I earn. I'm looking at, will my next generation have something similar, or will be enjoying what I'm enjoying today? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dhawan. I would like to thank all the panelists. It has been a very enriching and very interesting conversation. Thank you all of you for your time. We look forward to keeping you engaged.